The sound hit me first, a giggle, soft and breathy, floating down the hallway of my childhood home. It was wrong, completely wrong, because my mother never giggled like that. Not once in 32 years. I froze halfway through hanging up my coat, the fabric still bunched in my fingers. Another laugh, deeper this time. My father's voice, but pitched in a way I'd never heard before. Intimate. Secret. My name is Reagan, and in that moment, my entire world started to crack. I should have turned around. Should have walked right back out that front door and pretended I'd never stopped by to surprise my parents with lunch. Instead, I found myself moving down that familiar hallway, past the family photos that suddenly felt like lies. The whispers grew clearer as I approached my father's study. The door wasn't fully closed, just a sliver of space between frame and wood. Enough to see. Enough to destroy everything. "Henry, we shouldn't." The voice wasn't my mother's. It belonged to Vivian, my mother-in-law. Colin's mother. The woman who'd helped plan my wedding 3 years ago. "No one's home," my father murmured. "Linda's at her book club until 4. My hands started to shake. I pressed them flat against the wall, willing myself to stay upright as I peered through the crack. The scene burned itself into my brain, my father's hands in Vivian's perfectly styled hair, her red lipstick smeared across his collar. I must have made a sound, a gasp, a whimper, something, because they suddenly broke apart. But I was already moving, my feet carrying me back down the hallway on autopilot. I grabbed my coat and fled, not bothering to close the front door behind me. In my car, I sat gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles went white. My phone buzzed, a text from Colin asking if I wanted Thai food for dinner. My husband. Their son. The nausea hit hard and fast. Another text lit up my screen. This one from Vivian. "Reagan, dear, did you stop by the house?" Henry thought he heard something. The casual tone, the practiced normalcy, it made everything worse. How long had this been going on? How many family dinners had we sat through while they played their little game? How many times had my mother hugged this woman, welcomed her into our home? I started the car, my mind already racing ahead. Colin would be home in 3 hours. My mother would be finishing her book club soon, probably picking up groceries on her way home like she always did on Thursdays. Dad and Vivian would be straightening their clothes, erasing the evidence, rehearsing their lies. "Everything okay?" Colin texted again. "You usually respond right away." I stared at his message, my thumbs hovering over the keyboard. What could I say? "Sorry, honey, but I just caught your mother with her tongue down my father's throat. By the way, should we still do Thai for dinner?" Instead, I typed, "Had a rough meeting. Need some time to think. Don't wait up for dinner." The lie came too easily, but then again, lying seemed to run in the family now. I pulled away from the curb, my childhood home shrinking in the rearview mirror. The taste of bile rose in my throat as another text from Vivian appeared. "Call me when you can, sweetie. We should catch up soon." My finger hovered over the delete button, but I stopped. No, I'd keep it. Keep everything. Document every message, every call, every little breadcrumb they left behind. Because while they were busy playing their game, they'd forgotten something crucial about me. I'd inherited my father's patience and my mother's attention to detail. And now, I had a new purpose, making them pay for every single lie they'd told, every fake smile they'd worn, every moment they'd stolen from the people who trusted them. The game was just beginning, and they had no idea they were already losing. 3 days of dodging calls and making excuses had turned me into someone I barely recognized. I sat across from Colin at our kitchen table, watching him scroll through work emails while he ate his toast. My stomach churned at how normal everything looked, how easily lies could masquerade as ordinary life. Mom keeps asking if we're coming to dinner on Sunday, Colin said, not looking up from his phone. Says she's making your favorite, her famous pod roast. The fork in my hand clattered against my plate. I have that project deadline, I said, the words tasting like ash. Maybe next week. Colin finally looked up, his brow furrowed. That's the third time you've cancelled on them. Did something happen between you and Mom? If he only knew. I forced myself to meet his eyes, wondering how much of Vivian he saw in the mirror each morning. Everything's fine. Just swamped at work. You've been different lately. He reached across the table, his hand covering mine. The gesture that usually brought comfort now made my skin crawl. Talk to me, Reagan. My phone buzzed, another message from my mother. Are you sure you can't come over for coffee today, sweetie? Your father's been asking about you. I'm sure he has, I thought, deleting the message. The guilt of avoiding my mother was almost worse than carrying the secret of what I'd seen. Almost. I need to get to work, I said, standing abruptly. Colin's hand fell away, and the hurt in his eyes twisted something inside me. Big presentation today. Reagan, he started, but I was already grabbing my keys. Love you, I called over my shoulder, the words automatic but hollow. Instead of going to work, I found myself parked outside my parents' house, watching my father load golf clubs into his car. The same hands that had been tangled in Vivian's hair now waved cheerfully to a passing neighbor. The casualness of it made me sick. My phone rang, Vivian's number flashing on the screen. I answered before I could stop myself. Reagan, darling, her voice dripped honey and poison. We need to talk about what you think you saw. Think I saw. The laugh that escaped me didn't sound like my own. That's interesting phrasing. Things aren't always what they seem. A pause, calculated. I'd hate for any misunderstandings to hurt the people we love. Colin, for instance. Don't. My fingers tightened on the steering wheel. Don't you dare bring him into this. He's already in this, dear. He's my son. Another pause. Why don't you come over for tea? We can discuss this like adults. Through my windshield, I watched my father drive away, probably headed to his weekly golf game. Or maybe to meet her. Sorry, Vivian. I'm all booked up with adult activities like not sleeping with other people's spouses. I hung up before she could respond, my hands shaking. The front door of my parents' house opened, and my mother stepped out, watering can in hand. She looked so peaceful, tending to her flowers, humming to herself. The sight of her broke something in me. My phone buzzed again, a text from Colin, whatever's going on, I'm here. Always. The irony of his loyalty, inherited from his father no doubt, made me want to scream. Instead, I started my car and drove to work, where I spent the next hour in my office, creating a new folder on my laptop. I labeled it Family Photos and started documenting everything, screenshots of messages, times, dates, locations. Another text arrived, this time from my father. Honey, your mother's worried sick. Whatever's bothering you, we can work it out. I added his message to the folder, then opened my calendar. Sunday dinner was still marked in bright red, a weekly tradition now tainted. My cursor hovered over the entry as I considered Vivian's invitation to discuss things. Maybe it was time to accept. After all, every good revenge story needs a catalyst, and what better way to start than letting them think they had the upper hand? I typed a quick response to Colin, actually, tell your mom Sunday works after all. Wouldn't miss her pot roast for anything. The game was changing, and this time, I'd be the one making the rules. Sunday dinner arrived with the subtlety of an approaching storm. I watched Vivian flutter around her dining room, arranging flowers she'd just picked up at the market. The same market, no doubt, where she'd been meeting my father every Thursday after his golf game, a detail I discovered through 3 days of careful observation. "Reagan, sweetheart, you seem distracted." Vivian's perfectly manicured hand touched my shoulder. I fought the urge to recoil. "Is everything all right at work?" "Just fine," I said, noting how her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. "Though I've been learning some interesting things about retirement activities lately." Her hand twitched almost imperceptibly. "Oh. The market on Kingston Street," I said, maintaining eye contact. "I hear it's quite popular on Thursday afternoons." The color drained from her face for just a moment before she recovered. "Frank, darling," she called out, her voice steady but pitched slightly higher. "Would you help me in the kitchen?" I moved to the window, watching my parents' car pull into the driveway. My father emerged first, helping my mother out with practiced gentility. The sight made my stomach turn. "Reagan." Colin appeared beside me, his hand warm on my lower back. "You're shaking." Before I could respond, Frank's voice boomed from the kitchen. "What do you mean you've been handling the finances alone?" I edged closer to the kitchen door, Colin following. Through the gap, I saw Frank holding a stack of papers, his military posture rigid with anger. "It's nothing, dear," Vivian said, reaching for the papers. "Just some investment decisions." "Investment decisions that emptied our savings." Frank's voice cut like steel. "And who's Henry Davidson? His name is all over these transfers." My breath caught. "My father's name." "I can explain," Vivian started, but Frank was already storming out, nearly colliding with us. His eyes met mine, and something passed between us, a shared recognition of betrayal. The front door opened, bringing my parents into this powder keg moment. My mother's smile faltered as she read the room. "Is everything okay?" "Linda," Frank said, his voice eerily calm. "Did you know our spouses have been making investment decisions together?" My father froze in the doorway, his hand still on my mother's back. Vivian emerged from the kitchen, makeup perfect but hands trembling. "It's not what you think," she said, but her eyes were on me, pleading. "Then what is it?" I asked, my voice carrying a weight I didn't recognize. "Why don't you tell everyone exactly what's been happening on Thursday afternoons?" Colin's hand dropped from my back. "Reagan, what are you talking about?" "Yes, Reagan," my father cut in, his authority voice in full effect. "What exactly are you implying?" I pulled out my phone, scrolling through the folder I'd compiled. Funny thing about bank statements, they tell interesting stories. Like how two people keep meeting at expensive restaurants while their spouses think they're at golf games or book clubs. "That's enough," Vivian snapped, but Frank snatched the phone from my hands. The silence as he scrolled was deafening. My mother stepped forward, confusion etched on her face. "Henry." "It's not," my father started, but Frank cut him off. "6 months of transfers," he said, his voice deadly quiet. 6 months of lies. And not just the money, is it? He looked at Vivian, then at my father. "The Kingston Street Market isn't known for its investments, but it does have that quiet little hotel on the corner." My mother's knees buckled. I caught her before she fell, feeling her whole body trembling against mine. Colin stood frozen, looking between his mother and my father like he was watching a tennis match in hell. "I wanted to tell you," Vivian said to Frank, reaching for him. He stepped back. "No," he said, "you wanted to take everything. The money, the dignity, the trust." He turned to my father. "And you helped her do it." The room spun with unspoken accusations and shattered illusions. I held my mother tighter, watching the carefully constructed facades crumble around us. This wasn't how I'd planned to expose them, but sometimes revenge takes its own path. Perhaps, Frank said, straightening his shoulders, we should all sit down. There are clearly some things that need to be discussed. The pot roast burned in the kitchen, forgotten. No one moved toward the dining room. Some dinners, it turns out, are better served cold. The divorce papers sat unopened on my mother's kitchen table, a stark white reminder of how quickly lives can unravel. She hadn't stopped crying since Sunday's revelation, but today her tears had given way to something worse: silence. I've moved all the money to a separate account, I said, pushing a cup of tea toward her. Frank helped me track down everything Dad and Vivian hadn't already. Please, she whispered, don't say their names. My phone buzzed, another message from Colin. We hadn't spoken since he'd walked out of his parents' house 3 days ago. I'd given him space, knowing he needed time to process how his mother had destroyed 2 families with calculated precision. The doorbell rang. My mother flinched. I'll get it, I said, but when I opened the door, it wasn't my father begging for forgiveness. It was Vivian. You've made your point, she said, stepping past me without invitation. Now it's time to fix this mess before. She stopped short at the sight of my mother, who had risen from her chair with unexpected steadiness. Get out of my house. Linda, please. Vivian's perfect makeup couldn't hide her desperation. If you'd just let me explain about Henry. Explain what? I cut in. How you manipulated him after retirement. How you convinced him to invest in your imaginary business ventures. Vivian's composure cracked. You don't understand. Frank was suffocating me, controlling everything. Henry actually listened, actually saw me as more than just someone's wife. So you took his money, my mother said, her voice gaining strength. And his dignity. And his family. The money was an investment, Vivian insisted. In us. In our future. In your escape plan, I corrected, thinking of the offshore account details Frank had discovered. You never loved my father. You were using him to fund your exit strategy. The silence that followed confirmed everything. My mother sank back into her chair, and I watched another piece of her break. Colin's left me, Vivian said suddenly, her voice small. He won't return my calls. Frank's filing for divorce. I need someone to understand. Understanding isn't what you came for, I said, moving between her and my mother. You came because you're losing control. Because your perfect plan is falling apart. My phone buzzed again, this time with a text from Frank, found more accounts. Meeting at 3. Bring Linda. You think you've won, Vivian said, her mask slipping to reveal something darker. But you haven't thought about what this will do to Colin. To your marriage. How long before he starts to wonder if betrayal runs in his blood? The words hit their mark. I'd been so focused on revenge, on protecting my mother, that I hadn't considered how this would shape Colin's view of himself, of our future together. Get out, I said, but my voice wavered. He'll never trust you again, Vivian pressed. Not after you kept this secret, watched it destroy his family. No. My mother's voice cut through the room like steel. You destroyed his family. You destroyed mine. Reagan protected us from further harm. She stood again, stronger this time. Now get out of my house before I call Frank and tell him about the safety deposit box in Denver. Vivian's face went white. How did you? I was a banker for 30 years, my mother said. Did you think I wouldn't recognize the patterns? The transfers? I just never thought. She swallowed hard. I never thought it would be you. Vivian fled, leaving behind the scent of expensive perfume and desperation. My mother's hands shook as she picked up the divorce papers. Mom, I started, but she shook her head. We have a meeting at 3, she said, reaching for a pen. And I have 30 years of financial records to share with Frank's lawyer. I watched her sign her name, each stroke deliberate and final. My phone buzzed one last time. Colin, can we talk? About everything. The weight of secrets and revenge pressed against my chest. I'd won the battle against Vivian, but as I looked at my mother's trembling hands and thought of Colin's unanswered messages, I wondered if the war was just beginning. The coffee shop felt too bright, too normal for the conversation I was about to have. Colin sat across from me, his hands wrapped around an untouched Americano, looking like he hadn't slept in days. Neither had I. Start from the beginning, he said quietly. All of it. I pulled out my phone, sliding it across the table. The evidence is all there. Bank statements, hotel receipts, messages. Your mother and my father. No. He pushed the phone back. I want to hear how long you knew. How long you watched me kiss my mother goodbye at family dinners while knowing what she'd done. The bitterness in his voice made me flinch. 2 weeks. 2 weeks. He laughed, hollow and harsh. 2 weeks of lying to my face. I was trying to protect. Who? He cut in. My father. Your mother. Or just yourself. Before I could answer, my phone lit up with a text from Frank. Emergency. Henry's threatening to expose corporate fraud at my company unless we drop the financial investigation. My hand started shaking. Colin, I need to. More secrets. He reached for the phone, but I pulled it back. His eyes hardened. Of course. Why stop now? Your father needs me, I said, standing. There's more happening than you know. Then tell me. He slammed his hand on the table, making other customers turn. Stop protecting everyone except us. The door chimed, and I saw my father walk in. His eyes locked onto mine, then shifted to Colin. The smile that crossed his face made my blood run cold. Son, he said, pulling up a chair. I was hoping to find you both here. Don't, I warned, but he was already settling in, every bit the charming father-in-law. Colin, I assume Reagan's told you her version of events, he said smoothly. But there are some things you should know about your father's company. About certain irregularities that your mother and I discovered. Colin's face drained of color. What are you talking about? Dad, stop, I pleaded, seeing his endgame. He was trying to turn Colin against Frank, to create doubt about who the real victims were. Frank's been embezzling for years, my father continued. Vivian came to me for help when she discovered it. Everything we did was to protect both our families from scandal. I watched Colin's world tilt again, saw the uncertainty creep into his eyes. He's lying, I said. Frank showed me the real records. They're trying to blackmail him now. Are they real records? My father asked innocently. Or fabricated ones to cover his tracks? Ask yourself who benefits from destroying your mother's reputation. Colin stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I need air. Colin, wait, but he was already pushing through the door. My father's mask slipped, revealing a flash of triumph. You should have stayed out of it, Reagan. Some things are better left buried. Like the money you stole. I pulled out a USB drive. Frank's lawyer has copies of everything. The real records, not your manufactured ones. It's over, Dad. Is it? He leaned forward. Because right now, your husband is questioning everything he knows about his family. About you. How long before he realizes you're just like me, willing to destroy people to get what you want? The truth in his words hit like a physical blow. I had become so focused on exposing their betrayal that I'd forgotten the cost. Every move I'd made to protect my mother had pushed Colin further away. My phone buzzed again, Frank sending documents, evidence that would bury my father and Vivian. All I had to do was forward them to the lawyer. Last chance, my father said, standing. Drop the investigation, convince Frank to back off, and we all walk away. Otherwise. He glanced toward the door where Colin had disappeared. Well, some marriages don't survive this kind of trauma. Just ask your mother. I stared at my phone, at the power to destroy lives sitting in my hand. The revenge I'd craved was within reach, but Colin's words echoed in my head, stop protecting everyone except us. The choice I made next would either save my marriage or serve justice. But as I watched my father walk away, I realized I couldn't have both. The lawyer's office felt like a tomb. Frank sat beside me, his military posture rigid as we watched the video playing on the conference room screen. My father and Vivian, caught by security cameras at various hotels, their secret meetings documented in crisp digital clarity. Turn it off, I said, but Frank shook his head. Watch. His voice was steel. Watch them destroy everything we built. The door opened and Colin walked in, followed by my mother. The look she gave me wasn't the broken one I'd grown used to, it was something harder, colder. I found these, she said, dropping a stack of letters on the table. Hidden in Henry's golf bag. They go back years. Years. Not months. Not since retirement. Years. Mom. Don't. She turned to Frank. Your wife didn't seduce my husband. They planned this together. All of it. The lawyer paused the video, clearing his throat. There's more. The company fraud allegations. They weren't entirely false. But it wasn't Frank's doing. My father's face filled the screen, caught in mid-conversation with the company's CFO. The timestamp showed 3 years ago, when he still worked there. When he'd recommended Frank for the position. He set you up, I whispered, understanding hitting like a physical blow. He put you in place knowing. Knowing I'd take the fall, Frank finished. While they cleaned out the accounts. Colin hadn't moved from the doorway, his face unreadable. Did you know? He asked me. When you started digging, did you know how deep this went? No, I said, but the word felt hollow. I should have seen it. Should have looked harder instead of focusing on my own revenge. The police have been notified, the lawyer said. They'll want statements from everyone. My mother laughed, a broken sound. Statements? About how I lived with a stranger for 30 years. About how I recommended Vivian for charity boards, helped her plan parties, while she stopped, pressing her hands to her mouth. We can still protect the company, Frank said. If we move quickly. Protect? Colin finally stepped forward. Like Reagan protected us by keeping secrets. Like you protected your reputation while my mother and Henry stole everything. Colin, I reached for him, but he jerked away. Don't. Just, don't. He turned to the lawyer. What happens now? Now? My father's voice came from the doorway. We all turned to see him standing there, Vivian beside him, both immaculate in expensive suits. Now we negotiate. Get out, Frank started to rise, but my father held up a hand. One phone call, he said smoothly. One call, and every major news outlet learns how Frank Mitchell's company has been laundering money for years. Your reputation, your freedom, gone. Along with yours, I shot back. Please, Vivian stepped forward, her eyes on Colin. Sweetheart, we can explain everything. We did it for you, for all of us. Stop. My mother's voice cut through the room. She stood, shoulders straight. I've called the police. They're on their way. The color drained from my father's face. Linda. I found something else in your golf bag, she continued. Records. Real ones. I gave copies to Detective Sanders this morning. The silence that followed was deafening. I watched my father's mask crack, saw the moment he realized his perfect plan was falling apart. Mom. I whispered. I loved your father for 30 years, she said, not looking at me. But I won't let him destroy another family. Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer. Vivian grabbed my father's arm, panic breaking through her composure. Colin moved to block the door. Reagan, my father turned to me, desperate now. Tell them about Frank's offshore accounts. About the evidence you found. The evidence you planted. I pulled out my phone, showing the email chain I'd discovered. The breadcrumbs you left for me to follow while you set up Frank. The sirens stopped. Footsteps echoed in the hallway. I wanted justice, I said, watching my father's face. But you wanted revenge. There's a difference. The door opened. Detective Sanders stepped in, flanked by uniformed officers. Henry Davidson. Vivian Mitchell. She pulled out handcuffs. You're under arrest. I felt Colin's hand slip into mine as they led them away. Not forgiveness, not yet. But something like understanding. Sometimes revenge isn't about destroying people. Sometimes it's about letting them destroy themselves. The courthouse hallway stretched endless and cold. My father and Vivian sat on opposite ends of a wooden bench, their lawyers whispering strategies while we waited for the preliminary hearing. Colin stood by the window, his reflection fractured in the rain-streaked glass. They're offering a deal, Frank said, approaching our small group. In exchange for testimony about the company fraud. My mother's hands tightened around her coffee cup. Of course they are. The door opened, and Detective Sanders emerged. Mrs. Davidson. We found something in the safety deposit box. Before anyone could move, Vivian stood. Those documents are protected by. By what? I cut in. The same protection that covered the money you stole. Or the lives you destroyed. You don't understand, she said, her perfect mask cracking. What it's like to be invisible. To watch your relevance fade while your husband chases promotions and your son builds his perfect life with his perfect wife. Mom, stop. Colin's voice carried across the hallway. Just, stop lying. I never lied about loving you, she said, reaching for him. He stepped back. No, you just lied about everything else. His eyes met mine. Like mother, like daughter-in-law, right? Both of us keeping secrets, playing games. That's enough. My father stood, straightening his tie. Detective, whatever you found. Is a confession, Detective Sanders finished. Written by you, Henry. Dated 3 years ago. The silence that followed was absolute. I watched my father's face, seeing the moment his carefully constructed world began to crumble. A backup plan, he said finally, looking at Vivian. In case you ever turned on me. She laughed, high and brittle. Like you turned on Frank. Setting him up to take the fall while we. Well, you what? Frank stepped forward. Well, you systematically destroyed 2 families. Well, you manipulated everyone around you for what? Money? Power? Or just the thrill of proving you still could? My mother moved then, crossing to stand before my father. Why? The word carried 30 years of trust, shattered in a single moment. Because he could, I answered for him. Because they both thought they were smarter than everyone else. But you forgot something crucial. And what's that? my father sneered. That the truth doesn't stay buried. I pulled out my phone, playing a recording. His voice filled the hallway, discussing plans with Vivian from that first day I discovered them. I didn't just catch you in the act. I caught you confessing. Vivian lunged for the phone, but Colin caught her arm. It's over, Mom. No, she struggled against his grip. You don't understand. Henry promised we'd start over. A new life, away from. From what? Frank's voice was quiet but carried weight. From responsibility. From consequences. The elevator dinged, and more officers emerged. Detective Sanders nodded to them. Henry Davidson, Vivian Mitchell, she began, you're under arrest for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Wait. My father held up his hands. Reagan, please. You're my daughter. You can't. That's exactly why I can, I said, watching as they handcuffed him. Because you taught me about justice. About consequences. Consider this your final lesson. As they led them away, Vivian turned back. Colin, sweetheart, please. But Colin had already turned away, his hand finding mine in the silence that followed. What happens now? My mother asked, watching the elevator doors close on her marriage. Frank stepped beside her. Now we rebuild. Without their shadows hanging over us. I felt Colin's fingers tighten around mine. Not forgiveness, not yet. But something like understanding began to take root. The hearing's been postponed, Detective Sanders announced. Given the new evidence. We watched her walk away, leaving us in the hollow aftermath of justice served. My phone buzzed, a message from my father's lawyer about plea deals and reduced sentences. I deleted it without reading. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't in destroying someone's life. It's in letting them face the consequences of destroying their own. The rain continued to fall outside, washing away the last traces of secrets too long kept. The sentencing hearing ended quietly, without the dramatic outbursts I'd half expected. My father and Vivian accepted their plea deals with the same calculated precision they'd used to destroy our families. 5 years each, plus restitution. The judge's gavel fell like a full stop on a chapter one desperately wanted to close. Outside the courthouse, autumn leaves skittered across the steps. Colin stood waiting, his tie loosened, looking more like himself than he had in weeks. They're transferring them today, he said as I approached. Not mother, not father. Them. We'd both learned to distance ourselves from the wreckage they'd left behind. Frank's waiting at the car, I said. He and Mom are having dinner together. A small smile crossed Colin's face. Again. They understand each other now. I watched an elderly couple descend the courthouse steps, hands clasped tight. Sometimes betrayal creates stronger bonds than trust ever could. Speaking of bonds, Colin pulled an envelope from his jacket. The house listing came through. If you still want to sell. I do. My childhood home held too many shadows now. Mom's already packed most of it up. Said she needs a fresh start. Don't we all? He hesitated, then reached for my hand. I found something in the boxes. Letters from my mother to yours, from years ago. Before, everything. My throat tightened. What kind of letters? Friendship letters. Real ones. About hopes and fears and feeling invisible as they got older. Before the bitterness took over. He squeezed my hand. Makes you wonder when exactly people start becoming the worst versions of themselves. A police transport van pulled away from the curb. I caught a glimpse of my father's profile through the window, straight-backed and proud even in handcuffs. Still refusing to bend, even when broken. The company audit finished, Colin continued. Frank's name is cleared. He's talking about rebuilding, making something better from the ashes. And us? I finally asked the question that had haunted us for weeks. Are we rebuilding too? Colin turned to face me fully. You kept secrets to protect people. They kept secrets to destroy them. There's a difference. Is there? Sometimes I look in the mirror and see pieces of him. The calculation, the need for justice. The loyalty, Colin cut in. The strength to face ugly truths. The courage to bear the consequences of doing what's right. He touched my cheek. Those pieces aren't his to claim. My phone buzzed, a message from my mother. She'd found an apartment, small but bright, walking distance from Frank's place. Another buzz, a photo of her smiling, really smiling, for the first time in months. We should go, Colin said. Frank's making his famous lasagna. The one Vivian always claimed to hate. The very same. We descended the steps together, the autumn wind carrying away the last echoes of the gavel. Behind us, the courthouse stood silent, holding the final act of a tragedy that had started with whispers and ended with justice. But justice, I'd learned, wasn't the same as healing. Healing came in small moments, my mother's genuine smile, Frank's quiet strength, Colin's hand in mine as we walked away from the ruins of what was toward the possibility of what could be. Reagan, Colin stopped at the car. One more thing. I found this in my mother's study. He handed me a small notebook. Her diary. I haven't read it, but maybe understanding why people break isn't the same as forgiving them for the damage they cause. I took the notebook but didn't open it. Some truths could wait. Some wounds needed time before they could bear the weight of understanding. Frank waved from the driver's seat, my mother beside him, both carrying their own scars but finding ways to make them beautiful. Colin opened the car door, and I slid in, leaving the notebook closed on my lap. Sometimes the greatest revenge isn't in destroying what was, but in carefully, deliberately building something new from the pieces left behind. Something stronger. Something true. The car pulled away from the courthouse, carrying us toward a future we'd have to build ourselves, one honest moment at a time.